give a big thank kudos to Eli, for, again, all you do for Alluvium, the connection we've had, what you're doing, for the community, not just the houseless community. There's people are starving for spirituality as well as food, and people are starving for art and creativity and an outlet for it, and you are providing that. And so you're more than just feeding people in a physically nourishing way, you're helping to feed people in a spiritually nourishing way. And so we all thank you for everything that you do here. So, all right, well, again, thanks for being here. And this is kind of a different experience for me in this type of environment, talking about my work like this. So I'm grateful for it, and I appreciate y'all's patience and everything. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at some of this work, and I'll be talking about each piece a little bit individually, as well as some other concepts of art. And I also want to, I have a talk, but I want to have discussion and questions and, and some stuff too. So I want to make sure I save plenty of time for that to happen. So I'll talk a little bit about myself, I'll just expand upon a little bit of what Eli said. So art to me it's something that's been an enormous part of my life, my whole life. And I took to art making pretty, passionately, even as far as a 10-year-old can be, and on stuff, and took the art lessons and stuff. I have an aunt, and I want to give her some props. My aunt Diane, who is a painter, and she paints very traditional style oil paintings of cats and fruit and sunsets and things like that. And about a month ago, give or take, she was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it's spread to a lot of her body, and she has other health issues. And so it's a tenuous situation. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to express my gratitude for her, because I think without her as an artist, I wouldn't have had the same influence in my life with art. And so that's so to Aunt Diane, in Florida right now, thank you. And it's funny because she's, very, very conservative, spiritually, artistically, and politically, very, very conservative, but she's always been the adamant artist, and really believed in it, and it really helped to push me. She's one of the other people, that I know who has almost exclusively their own work hanging in their house, and, and that kind of thing. And so she was a real influence. I also, at this moment, want to give, now that I'm talking about it, I want to give a shout out to another aunt who was a very big influence, my stepmother's sister, who passed away a few years ago of cancer. She was also an artist in her own right, but what she really did for me, and I think it's very important. So we were at her house one time. My parents are divorced. This goes somewhere, don't worry. So my parents are divorced. I was with my dad that weekend. We were at my aunt Elaine's house, and I had brought some oil paint and some watercolor paintings that I had done. I was in high school, 16-ish, 17. I was looking to, starting to look for colleges and stuff. And I was showing my dad this artwork, and my dad, in classic my dad fashion, said something to the effect of, you're not good enough as a painter to do this professionally. It's like, just give it up. And oh God, I almost got rage there for a second, so calm down. And yeah, it does affect me. But so he said something like that. And then my aunt had overheard it, my aunt Elaine, and she pulled me aside and basically, in so many words, said, fuck that guy. It's like, do not listen to your father. And I took that to heart in many, many different respects. My dad, I know I'm going off topic here. My dad is one of those people who believe the earth is only 6,000 years old because the lineage of it can be traced back in the Bible, and the Bible is the absolute only authority of anything that's real in the world. So that's where I'm coming from, my family. My aunt says, no, don't listen to your dad. Your stuff is good. You believe in it, believe in yourself, and keep working on it. And now I have this work, and I have an absolute, not just a passion for art, but a complete and total utter service to art. I believe that I view myself as an art monk. I view myself as if I follow a religion, if I have any beliefs, it is art. And so, which brings us to why we're here and why I'm here to talk about art and spirituality. So the idea of art and spirit, I think, is connected and intrinsic as any things can be, really is. On a human level, it has been something that people have used, or should I say have served in some capacity, or both, honestly, in some capacity since our inception as conscious beings. Like we even have discovered works of art or some early stick line drawings that can be dated over 100,000 years. When I was in college, we were looking at possibly 30,000 years, and the caves of Lascaux were some of the oldest, and now that there's a lot more. So art making and image rendering in some capacity has been an enormous part of our human consciousness and our human existence, basically, since we've been human beings, since we were living in caves. Pre-Neolithic revolution, pre-civilization, art was very important. To this very day, it is important. If we look at the development of civilizations throughout history, as well as the development, or should I say, the continuing survival of the non-civilization communities of the world, every single group is connected to art, whether it be through elaborate tattoos that describe their existence and their deeds, to a connection to the spirit world, to masks that represent different gods and beings and connections to different spiritual entities or concepts. Every culture has some essence art. One of the hallmarks of the Middle Ages, which we often call the Dark Ages, witch burnings and such, one of the hallmarks of the Middle Ages is the cathedral. And it was the cathedral, the Romanesque cathedral, and then the Gothic cathedral. And what the cathedrals were is what they were essentially, they were a culmination of the scientific, architectural, artistic, and spiritual ideals, or should I say development of the time. And they were, considering most people like were living in straw thatched huts and going through filth for a living, the fact that these monumental cathedrals actually exist and they were able to put them up 1,000 years ago is really phenomenal. But to me, more than anything else, it shows an absolute galvanization of the human need for art and spirituality and the connection to it. These cathedrals were artworks. They had stained glass. Later on, the Gothic cathedrals developed stained glass. They had a very strong artful integration in their design. They had sculptures. They were these giant works of art and continue to be these giant works of art that attract lots of people. And this was in a time of great illiteracy and subservience to feudal and religious powers. And yet art was a hallmark, and people would go on pilgrimages to these places. You can imagine you spend most of your life, 20, 30, 40, whatever years in a farm, not doing much, barely getting by, giving all your crops to some feudal lord. But you go on a pilgrimage to Chartres Cathedral in France, for example, and you go to this place, and all of a sudden you're coming up, and I've been to Chartres, and I walked to it and seen it come up in the horizon, and it's amazing. Your sensibilities are blown away when you go into places like this. And then you walk into this cathedral, and the giant rose window is letting the sunlight in. Now, the shite was coming from the pulpit, but that's another story. The sun's coming in through this cathedral, and it's just this psychedelic kaleidoscope of colors all over the place. It's a mind-blowing spiritual experience, and it's an artful experience. If we go back even further, we have one of the greatest, and I mean that in terms of what it accomplished artistically, architecturally, and expansion-wise, as well as its longevity. One of the greatest civilizations that we know of is Egypt, ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, needless to say, is absolutely steeped in art and spirituality. Their very language was a visual language, and it was also much of their language of hieroglyphics, took certain images that were icons of different gods and goddesses and stuff, the cat or the eye and the bird and things like that. And they had developed that and incorporated that into their written language. But it was very, very spiritual. All kinds of things that happened in ancient Egypt. Art-wise, it's all related to a certain sense of spirituality. Almost all their art was about gods and pharaohs or scribes of the pharaohs who were divine leaders. And this whole lineage and the pyramids and everything, it's this incredible artistic enterprise. One of the first examples of an art rebel in history comes from ancient Egypt, and it was a pharaoh by the name of Akhenaten, who is probably more well known, or his son is a little bit more well known. His son was King Tutankhamun, King Tut, right? Who was a prepubescent ruler, and he didn't live all that long. So Akhenaten was his father. One of the great accomplishments of Akhenaten was an art spirit accomplishment. Okay, he did a number of things in ancient Greece. He demilitarized them to some degree. Egypt is a military state. They didn't like that all that much. He changed the capital of Egypt to Tel Amarna, and he also because it was like the home of the sun, and he, more importantly, changed Egypt's religion from a polytheistic religion to a monotheistic religion, which is a huge thing to do. It's like, okay, so we've been doing this for a couple thousand years. Now I'm the ruler. We're doing it different now. And it was huge, you know, and he believed in Aton, the sun god. He didn't deny the other deities. They were still there in the art, but he was essentially, they were all under the guise of this one monotheistic ruler. And so that was a very interesting. But one of the most notable of his accomplishments was how he had himself rendered in art. And this was an enormous step in human progress, even though it was kind of buried. Nothing ever gets buried. Like it exists, whether it's the Akashic record or other things. But what Akhenaten did was he defied the ideal representation of the image or of the pharaoh, and had his artists depict him as he was, which was a rather essentially kind of an ugly man. You know, he had like a prolonged or elongated features. You know, he had a body that was fairly feminine, like he had hips, and there's you know, some theorize that he was hermaphroditic, but he had himself depicted as he was. Now, for thousands of years, Egyptian art depicted the pharaoh and his people and the gods and stuff as super, right? You know, they were big chested and tall and all of these things. Even some of the, you know, there was females who were depicted as men, you know, and strong men. Akhenaten said, no, I'm going to depict myself artistically in the truth, or as much of the truth as he could see. Now, I hope you can appreciate, if you think about it, what a revolutionary idea this was and what that means for us today. Because what he did was he took art from this idealized thing and he brought it to reality. He changed an ideal of art and spirituality, and he conformed it to something that was much less tasteful, but much more honest. And it's a really, really important development in our evolution as people and as artistic beings. And so art and spirituality is huge, and it has been for a very long time. Ancient Greece and the Greek gods, Rome, you know, the Romans, like they weren't so artful. I mean, in a way, they copied Greek art, but they did. That's one thing that the Romans did, was they melted down Greek sculptures, and mostly of gods and goddesses and things like that. They melted down the bronze to make weapons, but they but they had marble copies sculpted. So they had a copy of the art, so they could melt the weapon stuff down, but they still maintained the art. That's actually a fairly sophisticated thing when you think about it. Like, they were respecting the art enough and the spiritual intention of the art, because again, they were saving, a lot of these sculptures were gods and goddesses and Olympians who were kind of deified and things like that. So it was really a rather heady thing that they did to maintain that art. A lot of the, you know, the same can't be said for a number of the groups that sacked Rome and destroyed a bunch of the art. But there might be a parallel there, you know, in artlessness and barbarism. You know, I can see that in our own nation, honestly, and I can see that in the way that our governments and corporations, you know, kind of rule things. It's fairly artless. So anyways, the connection of art and spirituality is a deep and ancient one. It is also one that maintains a relevance. So I'm going to skip a little bit of time and come to the 20th century. So in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, there was an enormous boom in art making, a huge change in art making, and it was felt across the world, and it was a really phenomenal thing, and that was the development of abstraction. Okay, the development of abstraction is one of the most important developments in human consciousness and in human evolution. I believe this. I'm proposing this as a hypothesis, but I think that the development of abstraction is one of the most important developments in human thinking in millennia. And I'm going to explain why and how that is relevant to spirituality, because I think it's one of the most important things that we have right now. But in the 20th century, we had artists who started to view artwork not as the image that it was depicting, but as the work itself, the process. And artists were doing this. You could look at Rembrandt's work and see brushstrokes, El Greco's work, see all kinds of brushstrokes and process. You could see the rhythm and the action and the composition in their brushstrokes, like it's all there. But by and large, especially, by the 19th century, 20th century, the image rendering was predominant over the process. And what the Impressionists, such as Monet, Renoir, did, Manet, and others, and the post-impressionists like Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cézanne and Seurat in particular, they really broke down the picture plane into areas, into just basically pure color and form, and then rendered that into an image. So basically, they were allowing the brushstrokes to exist. They were showing the process. And then if you look up close, you see all the dots and the lines and the forms. But if you back up, then you see an image. Now, this again was a fairly revolutionary process. Photography had come along just before Impressionism, and what photography wasn't necessarily intended as an art form or as a replacement of art. What it was a way for people to cheaply and effectively reproduce themselves in other images. Yes, some of the early daguerreotypes and stuff like Muybridge did artful photography and sequences. But essentially, it was a way to freed artists up from relentlessly having to be commissioned to do portraits and other types of images, and allowed the artist to explore what paint can do for its own sake. And that, again, was an absolutely enormous and important development. So then we come to around the 20th century, these artists have been painting, and now there's a new developments in Expressionism and whatnot. And we have people like Picasso starting to come to be. Now, I think it's very, very, very important to mention that Cubism, German Expressionism, the Blue Rider movement, Fauvism, and a lot of these artistic movements that were happening at this time were founded upon an excitement for recently discovered art from Oceania, Africa, the Americas. So artists were getting very excited about, and again, you got to take, things work in weird ways in this world. And colonialism introduced people to, there was a lot of pilfering of these masks, and there was a lot of very, very strongly disconnected to the true spiritual reasons behind a lot of this non-Western art making. But the Western artists saw something in it, and they started to see the potential of these types of abstractly rendered images and faces. And so Cubism, which it was heavily influenced, German Expressionism, all these movements were heavily influenced by spiritual art of the indigenous peoples of the world. Heavily influenced, and I think that's very important to say. And so there's a continued connection, even in their more materialism, to very deep artful spirituality. And that really kind of developed. So Cubism was also, it was a way of being able to view an image from multiple vantage points at the same time. So like Picasso would draw a model here, then he would go on this side of her and draw her on the same page. And then he'd go to the other side and draw her on the same page. And that's one of the reasons you start to get eyeball over here, nose over here, three eyes, and that kind of thing, that Cubism is famous for, which was, again, it was a fairly revolutionary way for people to view the picture plane. Art and spirituality then were now becoming connected to science and scientific discovery. Actually, it had been, it was starting in the 18th century. But in the 20th century, it was very big. Electricity, for example, heavily influenced the Italian futurist painters, and like Boccioni, for example, with these enormous abstractions that were just electric, and Balla, just very influenced by electricity and the motion of it and the colors of it. With electricity, there was a trade-off. We lost the night sky. That was just something that kind of happened for a lot of people, especially in the cities, because we lit up, we made so much, light pollution, it's very hard to see the stars. But we gained a new kind of a night sky, and we gained a new kind of connection to light. And artists started to do some very interesting things with these new connections to light. And we're able to paint later, and that changes things, So there was some very interesting phenomenon going on. But one of the most important artistic spiritual phenomenon that was happening in the 20th century, there was a group of artists who could loosely group together as spiritualists, and they kind of sort of knew each other, and they were more or less contemporaneous. But there is an artist who I believe is one of the most influential artists as far as the connection of art and spirituality, as well as the first abstract painter. And I'm not talking about Kandinsky here or Pia Mondrian. I'm talking about a woman by the name of Hilma Klint. Now, Hilma Klint was painting her first full out, all over abstract pieces around 1906. It was around the same time that Picasso was painting the Demoiselle d'Avignon, a very famous Cubist painting of the women, you know. There's a brothel scene actually, but you know, a very famous painting. So academic art was still dealing with expressionism and cubism and fauvism, which was Henry Matisse's big fields of color and stuff. And Hilma Klint was delving full on into the composition of a spiritual methodology through the use of color and shape and design. And I highly recommend looking up the works of Hilma af Klint. She's Swedish, and she did work in you know, Europe proper, the mainland, and Paris and different areas. So she was known, but she was very much a student of Rudolf Steiner, the metaphysicist, and was very into the idea of color and form and the power of that in nature and the universe, and the connections to creation and all this. Cosmic dragons and things like that were, I think, part of the thing. I think Rudolf Steiner talked about that. She was into that. But it was a very, very strong connection to art and spirituality. And in this strong connection to art and spirituality, she innovated a way of painting that I believe is going to be our vessel to a transformation of consciousness in the time to come. I cannot overstate how important I believe abstraction is to our development as conscious beings. If you think about art, we've been making art in some way, shape, or form for, let's say, 100,000 years, maybe longer. We don't know. We can't rely on all of our records or our methods of calculating history. And in all of that time, there has been design, there has been abstract forms and designs. For very famously, Islamic art tends to be abstract, calligraphy, and very design oriented, because the tenets of the Quran say that you can't make an image of man because it's idolatry, you know, and so they don't tend to do that. And so there's definitely the idea of the non-representational design or image in art throughout history. But as far as the full-on abstract concept and the painting abstractly and allowing a painting or a work of art to exist without another purpose is a relatively new concept. And if we've been painting for 100,000 years and we've just figured out abstraction 100 years ago, 120 years ago, well, what are we going to be doing with what can we be doing with abstraction in 100,000 years, right? I believe that the doors are absolutely and totally wide open, and I believe that it's a big development towards our spirituality. I do want to mention, I guess, I mentioned Hilma Klint, and she's great. Kandinsky was another one. And I'm going to tell you an anecdote here to introduce this next artist, who is one of a very important spiritual artists. You've all seen his work in some way, shape, or form, whether it's on the bottle of hair care products or in packaging for some type of crackers or whatever. It became a very stylistic, it became a very chic design. And I'm talking about the artist named Pia Mondrian. So Pia Mondrian was the artist who did black line, red square, blue square, yellow square. So does everybody kind of recognize that imagery? So this was not a tongue-in-cheek stab at academic painting. It was not I'm just going to do as little as possible and make a fortune. It wasn't like that at all. This was a very, very spiritual concept. He was really working hard to connect the art and the spiritual in the larger metaphysical sense. He was working to break down art and art rendering, art making, into its bare bones functions. Horizontal, vertical, black, white, the three primary colors. And he believed that if he created works in fields of these colors, it would hit people's essence, and that people would feel a very deep spiritual feeling from it, because it's sort of the primeval language of our consciousness. And that was a fairly big and heady concept. And so that was very powerful. And so it's when I learned that about his work, I developed a whole new respect, for it. And it was like, yeah, this actually means something. And then when you see it in person, it's very powerful stuff. So the first time I got to see Mondrian in person, I was in New York. It was the very first time in New York City. So my first time in the Museum of Modern Art. I was in college and I was full on into all this stuff. I was full on in the art history department. I was tutoring. I was so into it. So I go to New York with my friends. We're at MoMA for 5 or 6 hours. So they're ready to go. They're done. And I'm still just as energized as I was when we walked in 6 hours ago. So we're about to leave. And I tell my friends, we're literally in the lobby. We're literally walking out the door. I tell my friends, all right, hold on 1 second. I'll be right back. Or I didn't even say, hold on 1 second. I just looked at them and I said, I'll be right back. And they looked at me funny and I bolted and I ran. And my thought was, I'm going to see the Mondrians one more time. I got to go see them one more time before we leave. I love they had his own little room back in the old MoMA. And the new one, it's not so much. I like the old one better, but that's another story. So go to the Mondrian room. I'm going in the room and then someone's coming out. Some guy about my age, a little bit taller, and he kind of smiles at me and I smile back, whatever. And then he's this weird look on his face. I'm like, whatever. I walk into the room, he walks out. Now I'm alone in this room. I'm looking at the Mondrian paintings, and on a wall, on one of the pieces, there is this big blue splotch that could not have been there before. And it was not rendered by Mondrian. And I'm looking at it, it was a bright, bright phosphorescent blue. It was blue, 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 blue. And I'm like, if I didn't know any better, I would say that someone threw up on this painting, but it's too blue. There's no way. And so I'm looking at this, and at this point, 1 or 2 other people come into the room. And then security comes in. Everyone out, everyone out, everyone out. And they clear us all out. And I'm like, oh my God, what did I just witness here? And so I go down the escalator, and my friends are down there in the lobby waiting, and their eyes are wide like this. My eyes are wide like this. And they ask me, they're like, what did you do? Because from their perspective, they saw me go, I'll be right back, and then run up the stairs. And then a minute later, security, run up the elevator. And so they thought I had tried to maybe take a painting home with me or something like that. And I mean, their concerns honestly weren't entirely unfounded, but I wouldn't steal a piece, but I mean, I got up the hijinks in those days. But anyways, also another story. But no, and I told them what happened. And I couldn't wait to go back and tell the art history department stuff. So this is what actually happened. I found out a little bit later. So there was this art student from Ontario, Canada, who walked past me as I walked into the room, who wanted to do a piece of performance art where he vomited in the 3 primary colors of red, yellow, and blue on 3 pieces of modern art that he considered to be mundane modern art. So he puked blue first on the Mondrian in MoMA. The day that I was there, when I decided after 6 hours and about to leave to run up to look one more time. He did that. And then he did, I think it was yellow on a Raoul Duffy in Ontario, and he was arrested before he ever got to red. But that's what happened, and that's what I witnessed. To me, this was a galvanizing moment to tell me that I was in the right place. I was doing what I needed to do. This was Providence or the universe saying something to me, and it was a very profound experience. And I've had other such experiences through art. Not anything quite like that, of course, but a lot of pretty profound and amazing experiences through following art and following that intuition. So I wanted to bring that up because I believe there's a connection to it all. Mondrian was a very spiritual painter. I was connected to that. I went up to see him again. I was called somehow and I witnessed this anti-art type of exhibit, which to me really helped because I kind of did some performance art stuff and some anti-art kind of stuff at the time, shop art. Surprise, surprise, and different things in college. And this was something that really helped me to see the difference. It helped me it woke me up a little bit. Like, no, that's not art, that's vandalism. Like this is someone puking on something isn't an artistic statement. It's just, it's counter art, it's anti-art. And so it was a very profound moment, and it was something that really connected me again to the spirituality behind art. So let me just check the time because I know I could talk the whole time. Oh my goodness. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more and then I would like to open it up to discussion so we can talk some. And so art and science. I want to just talk a very little bit about art and science because we talk about science a lot here, but there's a lot of parallels in art and science. And it's been happening through history. There was a writer named Leonard Shlain who wrote this wonderful book called Art and Physics, and it shows through history the parallels, the premonitions artists have towards physics. If you look at one of Hieronymus Bosch's famous painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, with the whole piece, if you look at the infernal part of it, there's like a mushroom cloud, you know, in the back, you know, and there's like this premonition of doom that we created 500 years later. So it's very interesting. But as far as today, so there's a couple of things I think in these works that act as an example. One of those things is the idea of the parallax perspective of something. So the parallax, and I'm not a super scientific at all, so I hope I get this right. The idea of the parallax is basically, it's a relationship of a viewer to an object in space at a fixed plane and the movement around that object compared to another object. Does that make any sense at all? So basically, like, looking at, let's say, Leslie, this pole, right, is creating a parallax viewpoint that's creating different relationships between me and you. And so it's not the same thing. And I'm seeing things from different perspectives with different relationships. If we start working art, and so I do paintings that are sculptural, and I don't sculpt them. I try to paint them stroke at a time. I really am emphatic about remaining a painter as these things become sculpted. But it creates a different composition from different viewpoints. It relies on a parallax view to create through a sameness, yet a different set of relationships of angles, a different set of relationships of colors, and a different set of relationships of light and dark. So this type of art and 3D art rendering can be a way of reestablishing our connection to composition, what composition means, how we view artwork. And it's something that they use a lot in astrophysics. So there's that relationship to art and current science, astrophysics, for example. So that's a big one. The idea of neon and neon color, fluorescent color. So if you look at a picture from the Hubble telescope, like on Astronomy Picture of the Day is a great website, and they show pictures of nebulas and stuff. They are rendering these with ultraviolet lights or different types of lights, right? You know, so it's not like you look in the sky and you see this. These images are rendered with different sorts of lights. So if we play with different sorts of lights in artwork, we can get different phenomena. So Eli, may I have the lights for a moment, please? So here we have a painting that is, well, it's a painting. It's kind of vortexual. It's got a nebula quality. But in the black light, it is a whole different feel. Now, one of the things that I am exploring with fluorescence is the idea of depth in space. Generally, when you're looking at fluorescent artwork, it's flat, right? Flat and bold, but fat, solid lines. I am actually trying to make grays and depth and have the same senses of depth that you might do in a landscape painting, but using only fluorescent paint. And as far as I know, that's not something that's explored. I've never seen it. I haven't seen it. But again, it's a way that we can explore newly developed types of technology. Picasso didn't have this kind of paint, you know, or these kinds of lights. So we can develop these new kinds of technology, and it relates very directly to the things that we're seeing in outer space and the concept of seeing new compositions and new things in different lights. And then, so look at the difference in this piece with the fluorescence and then without it. So, okay, so see that, and then without. Right? They're like two completely different paintings. And so using different lights can allow us to create different types of paintings with the same composition. It allows us to view the color relationships and the form relationships in a whole new way. And that's what things are really all about. And that's the power of abstraction, the power of color and form. When we look at a sunset, we aren't mesmerized and in love with the sunset because of the fact that it's a setting sun. For the mechanics of it, it's the color, right? It's the color, it's the form, it's the dance of everything. It's the abstraction of it. And so that's why it's so important. One of the many reasons it's so important that we continue to develop that relationship with beauty and with nature and with art rendering, because it is not the image. There was, on one of these days, I will get his name right. There was an old Indian philosopher, well, he's dead now, but I saw some interviews with him, and he really, really good understanding of art. And he basically said to the effect of, any type of image making in art is politics. It's like as soon as your art becomes of anything, it's politics. Basically what he's saying is you're politicking an idea. You're presenting something for somebody to understand the way you understand. You are presenting whether it's a landscape or a picture of Donald Trump shaking the hand of the devil or whatever it is. It is, you know, or you know, if it has a fair, all of these things have implications. They have implications to us because of a specific direct image. But what if we are just dealing with pure color and form? How is that going to relate to us? That is not political. That reaches us on a deep level beyond our need to decipher anything. And that's a huge part of our spirituality, right? Our spirituality doesn't necessarily come from constant deliberation and deciphering. It comes from that moment of clarity where you get that essence where you're connected to the universe. So another important thing about art, before I wrap this up, I've missed a lot of things, but that's okay. The next time it'll be 3 hours long, and one of you will stick around. Art and space-time. So imagine listening, now music is art. It's certainly a form of art, or can be, but when we're dealing with visual art, we're dealing with a different perspective. I know I keep moving around. I'm making your job hard, Eli. Imagine, however, listening to Beethoven's symphony in the split second. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is 72 minutes long. Imagine listening to that into a split second. Basically, it sounded like one of my jams with like my star music, right? You know, it probably sounds cooler than that, honestly. But you need to experience it in linear time. Okay, art is created in linear time, but it's experienced in space-time. It's experienced as one process. So as we talk about space-time being a dimension and being able to step outside ourselves and see the past, present, and the future at one, that's art. That's what it is. That's what you're looking at. You're seeing everything kind of at once. You're seeing this whole process that went through. You're seeing the future in it even, you know, like the motion doesn't stop and it imbibes the continued connection to consciousness. So you're seeing all of these things at once. So art really is a way that we can view space-time from that larger outside ourselves nonlinear perspective. Art is inclusive. I believe that art is one of those things that can include everything. And in a time that we're looking to be more inclusive and we're trying to find a way where we all fit somehow, art does that. You know, you can't have art really, or the development of art without accident. You cannot have the evolution of life. You can't have the changing of genetic code without accident, without some type of serendipity. So art relates to that completely. So much of the stuff that I do, it comes from working on something and then maybe a trip happens or you know, a new thought, and then I move and I change with it and allow the art to guide me. So it's kind of an inclusion. Art in and of itself, again, when we were talking about the politicking of art, art is not inherently moral. I mean, orcs make music, right? You know, music, theatrics, theater, drama was a big part of the Third Reich's, you know, propaganda approach to get people involved. So it can definitely be used for ill. I mean, but still, it's there. Like orcs still have music, right? They're still making art. Like smash them up and grind them up and whatever it is, you know, but it's still, and so there's, to me, that's hope. That's hope that there's a way that we can continue to grow and connect all of us artfully, not opposed to each other, you know, not the orcs versus the elves or whatever, but all of us together. So to me, that brings hope. Art's a harmony of contrast. I think that's a principle that's important. Compositions of serendipity and the beauty of everything. And I do really, truly believe art is a service. I don't believe it is, I don't use it as a form of expression. When people talk about that, you're expressing yourself. No, I'm serving form and color and consciousness. I really believe art is the oxygen of consciousness. We have space, and as soon as we have the infinite universe, which is this one page, as soon as there's anything at all, you have drama, you have contrast, you have art. From some perspective, this will move a form, a consciousness. The more we develop that and make things, you know, the more we have. So let me ask a question here. How many shapes do we have here? Yes. 2. Okay, that is right. You have 1, 2. You have 1, 2, 3, because this white that's around it is a shape. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. Because this is bouncing to this. This is just intrinsically connecting to this, and these are hooking up. and that makes a shape. So if I did something like this, now it's even more, right? You have the triangle, you have one line, you have one, what's rectangle, two rectangles, three rectangles, a triangle, you have circles that are starting to happen, like, and more. So like, it's an incredible phenomenon. And we've talked in Alluvium too, a little bit about the concept of if there's absolutely nothing and we have an infinity of nothing, eventually something will happen. I mean, there's like, right, there's I forget what it was called, but there's, you know, principle that eventually there'll be some kind of a vibration, or like the fact that something will exist is inevitability, even if it takes an infinite amount of infinities. Well, if you stare at a page long enough, you're gonna see stuff. You know, you don't even have to stare that long, depending on your life experience or whatnot. But and so there's just so many parallels to the way that we use physics to try to discover our world, and the way that we can use art to try to discover our world. So in conclusion, I just want to say this, that I want everyone, if anyone takes anything away from this, I want it to be that art is so much more than a subjective form of expression. It is that, but it is so much more. And the more that we appreciate, the more that it is, the more that we see that art can be used to really discover some deep and powerful truths about our universe and our connection to reality, the more that we see it as not just something fun for kids, or, you know, or like the Bob Rossi thing to do on a Saturday afternoon, the more that we will really connect to our true selves and our true purpose as consciousnesses. And I think part of that really is to connect to creations. Why is anything here in the first place? And I think art is one of the first and foremost answers to that question. And it is one of the things that will continue to serve us and help us to unite as people and unite with all the other living entities. All the other living entities that that might exist, you know, whales, aliens, and so on and so forth. So, all right. So I want to thank you all very much. Is there anything else I really need? No, I got most of it, I think.
We do have time for some questions.
Yeah, I wanted to.
10 minutes left, or 5 or 10 minutes.
So yes, please. Any questions or comments, or anyone I want to have any dialogue?
I did put out the open mic sign up sheet, so if people do want to start signing up, you're welcome to. Please do it in a quiet, respectful way.
So yeah, any comments, questions, concerns? Anyone think that what I said was ridiculous? You know, anyone agree?
What about the relationship between there are people who are capable of abstracting more and experiencing art and consciousness in a different way than people who sort of think more concretely? Do you have any insight into like that divergence of perspectives?
Yeah, I think I do. I think that at one point we definitely need to have some concrete thinking, and we also need to have the divergence into abstracting, or we have to have a large sense of abstracting. If every single person in the world was as abstractly minded and kind of flighty or whatever as me, then nothing would get done. Like, let's just be honest, like but are the things we're doing the things that we really want to do? I mean, that's another question. I think that part of what the evolution of consciousness might be is a integration of both of those things into more people. So rather than having these large distinctions of concrete, solid, non-abstract thinking and way out in the clouds thinking, we have we still maintain our individuality, we maintain our independent identity and our uniqueness, but we're more integrated in understanding those things, understanding both the concrete and the abstract. I think that's something that can happen. As far as the right now, I think that it's like when we're looking at two sides of a way of looking at things. I don't think one is exclusively wrong or one exclusively right. So there's a way that we can come together. Is that kind of?
Some interesting insights there.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is like a limited amount or a limited number of like spiritual entities that you interact with or like channel while you're making art, or do you think you can like grow the number of or the amount of that force?
That's a good question. I know that there are some certain ones that repeat, and for me, and there are certain things that come up, and I have a bit of a pantheon, but I do believe that that there's always going to be more. I don't think there's a limit to it. I think that in some way, shape, or not a limit that we can fathom, places. So I think they do keep coming up, and I think they reforge and every time we make art, every time something happens, every time a person is kind to someone or whatnot, I think there's a metaphysical response, and it could be the development of new entities or essences. Right on. Yeah.
These pieces seem like they require so much time to make, and I'm wondering, what do you think about during the time? Is it just meditative and you kind of enter like a fugue state almost, or?
Kind of, sort of. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I will put on, maybe, and I'll do like a form of, like, I don't know, junk food in a way. Like I'll put on like a movie I've seen 100 times, you know, just to have some type of something going on that's not requiring my attention, so I can focus on here. I do think about my work, but I really try to have it be intuitive. And in my mind, the way it is, I'll wander. I mean, I'll start thinking about like, you know, like, I don't like my dad, or this and that, you know, or whatnot, and some things, and then I'll have to refocus, and then I'll go, huh, all right, maybe I got off track here, and I'm gonna get back on track or whatnot, you know, that kind of thing. If I'm thinking about the work, it's often in the forms of insight or like a larger lesson that I'm getting from the piece, less of where do I put my red or where do I put my blue, and more of, yeah, this kind of formation is something I can really work with in the future because it's got this type of texture and this doesn't, or, you know, that kind of thing. So, yes. Oh, hey, okay.
I'm just going to point about abstract art being not political. I would say it very much is extremely political. The questions of who gets to make art, who has the time, who has the disposable income, who gets accepted in the galleries. When we look at all the major abstract artists from the late 19th, early 20th century, those things are moving at sub-beats for millions and millions of dollars. Now, when I look at my own peer group, poor, working class, or native tribal people, when we make art, it generally commemorates something in the community, or rituals, preserves history, and combines to the sense of being together in a shared experience, where it often seems to me like abstract art is really just about the ego of that one painter, and it has to be explained to normal people. It's not about community exactly. I'd say it is very kind of hard to get away from anything that isn't political.
Well, that is true, you know, and that's a good point. With what you said, the art itself, the art making, if we take out the Clem Greenbergs and their critical reviews that he was getting a cut on, you know, or whatnot, you know, we take out, you know, that politics, if we take out, like you said, who gets to make it, who has access to the materials and stuff. And if we just happen to come to this planet and don't know any of that stuff, but the first thing we see is a Pollock painting, you know, like that's sort of the experience that I'm talking about. It is just when we just look at color and form for its own sake, not the mechanics behind it, not how, you know, not the politics of the art world, which suck, absolutely, and there's a big problem with that, and there historically has been. Then I think that we come to a point where it tries to be as pure as it can. And as far as, I think that the idea of abstraction is fairly new, and people didn't get Impressionism. It took decades, if not longer, for people to get Impressionism, and they thought it was an abomination. Kandinsky had this concept that, you know, art kind of trickles down, innovation trickles down. You know, it doesn't necessarily hit the masses or a large sense of understanding immediately, but eventually it kind of does. You know, punk rock was just, this is kind of I don't know if this is a good example, but you know, it was considered an abomination to a lot of people and a radical rebellion. And now it's bubblegum, you know, it's like everyone's got like dyed colored hair and piercings and whatever. And it's like, you know, and even that was taken from other cultures and stuff. But no, it's a good point. Yes.
Do you mind? I know we have more questions. Do you mind if I go ahead and stop there? And the reason why is because I want to get set up for the open mic, but I also want to allow about 10 or maybe even 15 minutes, just because I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say let's make some time before we start the open mic proper to, number one, make some connections with each other and socialize. And number two, also, I feel like to be able to check out this artwork up close, I'd be remiss if I didn't. You should just come and stick your nose sort of up against these pieces. So I would encourage you to ask the artist more questions. And we're going to be doing this every Sunday at 6 o'clock. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say we have some really great speakers coming up. We've got Dr. Ramon Alvarado from the University of Oregon talking about the philosophy and ethics of artificial intelligence. That should be really interesting. And we do have a goal of evolving this lecture series into sort of a set of micro lectures that can almost turn into a TED Talk, with the overarching goal of also making sure that there are more bridges between the U of O community and the neighborhoods of Eugene, like this neighborhood. And I would also definitely be remiss if I didn't say that was a really fantastic talk, probably one of the best that we've had at our deep discussion series. So we should all give Will a really huge round of applause.
Appreciate you letting me share my viewpoint and my passion for art, and when I shared. And once again, thank you, Eli, for having this series and all these cool people. Thank you all very, 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 very much.